Entertainment presents ReD, Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective, written and performed by LASHLEY-JOHNSTONE. Chapter 26, Crime Scene City, Part 1.
The Baltimore crime rate was infamous. There was no denying that. And DANIKA had a lot of history there. Not so long ago, she had been a member of a hacker group that were heavily involved in attempting to expose and utilize holes in the SparkAngel security network. Before the takeover, people's information was somewhat private. If you knew how to fall off of the grid at the drop of a hat, you could. But after the takeover, privacy's throat had clearly been cut. Truly, its entire head of liberation severed. SparkAngel's network didn't just stop at your mobile phone reception, your internet connection or device operating system. That was just how it started, but it became so much more than that. It started with a user-integrated operating system. Their platform integrated every user's data and preferences and fed on that information to create a completely unique and tailor-made user experience. Of course, at the start there was a backlash with the issue of privacy, a backlash that DANIKA and others like her had been a part of. But eventually, due to the usual suspects of advertising, free giveaways and free live-stream demonstrations with an audience in the billions, it became clear that SparkAngel was going to take over the lives of US citizens. It was more prevalent in some places than others, but it was nationwide. And because Doug Harrison had overseen the launch and the takeover, he became a public face, and gifted himself a hell of a backing for his campaign. All it took was one dead president. It sickened DANIKA as she sat in the armoured vehicle, stuck in traffic due to the chaos on the streets, to think of how easy it was for SparkAngel to take over a city like Baltimore. Throughout some of the major cities in the US, a vast network of interconnected control centres was set up to help regulate, and to some extent, automate the cities. The traffic, the artificial light, the water supply, although that was still in the development stage as far as DANIKA knew. The money coming from some unknown source, probably a contact of Harrison's. While all of this was going on, questions were still being raised as to where Obama stood on the subject of the automation. He refused to answer questions as to where the money was coming from, and in the weeks leading up to his death, he made very few public appearances. He must have known something was coming. DANIKA suspected that the takeover was linked to his death. Some freedom fighter deciding that the best option was to kill a president who sold out the American people's privacy, without even saying a word. It was a good motive, DANIKA thought, but not the solution. And after his death, a frightened silence had fallen over the country. The vice president, who nobody really took to, became a placeholder while they searched for an established, vetted candidate. And who should crop up but the man who was overseeing one of the biggest technological movements in US history? A man who now held the security of major parts of America in his hands. Making him not look or seem like an evil overlord, however, that was up to the combined efforts of the SparkAngel and Binder Holdings advertising divisions. They painted Harrison as a man you could trust, and a man who had already been vetted by the government because he was overseeing a countrywide security takeover. Therefore, all he had to do was enter the campaign and run. All of this and more was what DANIKA and the other members of the hacktivist group, Division 00, had learned over the months and eventual years of the takeover. For a time, their work consisted of breaking into the data control centres and attempting to decrypt as much information from the terminals as possible. They needed to learn how the information flowed through all of their operations. From someone's phone network to the automated traffic light and crisis response networks. They needed to know who was footing the bill for all of it. This, of course, was before Harrison's inauguration. Even though his first and only term didn't start to take a proper dive until a few months in, there was still a lot of backlash to the choice of president, both in the inner political circles and publicly. But due to the size of the SparkAngel network, that was a backlash that he, Doug Harrison, could somewhat control. And that was what DANIKA's job later became, to make him lose control of that information, and of himself. It was no less than he deserved. Cities with a high crime rate, like Baltimore, were cracked down on, and in the beginning, people like DANIKA had to do a lot of running, a lot of fighting, and a lot of hiding. But as Division Zerzero learned more about the network, it became easier to hide, and running was less necessary. Whenever they made a hole in the network public, however, they had to run like they'd never ran before. The crime rate decreased slightly as the automation set in the early days. But after the campaign, and Harrison's spending began to affect the economy, however, no amount of automation could keep a lid on this particular can of worms. And so DANIKA decided to leave and head back to New Jersey to lay low for a while. Plus, Spark Angel hadn't quite fully taken over the state. Yet. Being back in Baltimore now made DANIKA extremely nervous. There was a complete tailback on the I-95 just outside Morale Park, leading into Halethorpe. An accident, or 6, had created a jam, and so their only option was to turn into Baltimore and rejoin the I-95 further down at Arbutus, just after the blockage and the Halethorpe exit. She had looked on the submission platform as they left Wilmington, trying to determine the current state of the cities nearest to the outbreak. Rioting was commonplace now, but Baltimore was worse. The place was on fire. There were people all around, screaming, fighting, gunshots, revving engines.
"How the hell are we going to get through here?"
DANIKA asked. ARKHAM stuck his head out of the window, much to DANIKA's astonishment. She decided she wouldn't be surprised if his head got smashed in.
"There's a roadblock a couple of 100 yards down."
He brought his head back in, sitting back down and lighting a cigarette.
"I can see a few cop cars, and hear a lot of shooting."
"Well, we're never going to get through until the shooting stops," Martin said. "The traffic indicator has given me a route I can follow, to Wilkins Avenue through Orleans Street on the east case, but in order to get to the start of that route, we have to get past this roadblock."
"The Mill Hill Road?"
DANIKA asked. "That's right," Martin said.
"What do you suggest?"
ARKHAM asked. It was clearly a loaded question. "Someone has to go out there and determine the cause of the roadblock, deal with said cause, and unblock it," Martin said, suddenly shunting into the back of a station wagon in front. "Oops."
"Someone?"
DANIKA asked. "Well, it's not going to be me," Martin said. "I'm the designated driver."
"Yeah,"
grunted ARKHAM.
"And a fine job of that you're doing so far, too."
DANIKA chortled, then looked at ARKHAM.
Fine, we'll go."
DANIKA stopped smiling.
"Wait, what? What do you mean, we?" "Well, I could use the company. And trust me,"
ARKHAM pointed at Martin.
"you don't want his company."
"No, you really don't," Martin said.
"Plus,"
ARKHAM said, with a knowing look in his eye, making for the door handle,
"I want to see what you got."
She looked out of the tinted window. She looked at the violence, the fear, the hate. She breathed it in, then looked back at ARKHAM, whose knowing look had transformed into a knowing smile.
"Right back at you,"
DANIKA said, suddenly deciding that it was time to let loose. It had been a while. DANIKA had had to fight for her life on multiple occasions, and she'd learned things from both professionals and amateurs that had given her the confidence to leap into the fray when circumstances warranted it. She was a self-made survivor.
"Take this,"
ARKHAM said, pushing a Glock 17 pistol into her hand.
"Keep it holstered. I'd like to avoid getting into a shootout."
Martin grunted.
"Shut up,"
ARKHAM snapped. DANIKA holstered her gun as she slid out of the car, giving Martin the briefest of glances. He was just staring forward, waiting. They were on the corner of East Pratt Street and North Central Avenue, just across from the National Aquarium inside the Inner Harbor. They needed to clear the block further up North Central Avenue. All of the other side roads were clogged with rioters, violent rioters, who all wanted a piece of everyone else. There were 2 red brick buildings on either side of her. Bollards lined the sides of the road, occasional ones in the middle, separating the traffic. She could see now that the next bollard down had 2 police cars either side of it. The occasional gunshot rang out, and DANIKA prepared herself. She remembered a night in her past, a night where she had had to fight harder than she had ever fought before. A terrible night. She breathed in as she took in the scene around her. People everywhere with various agendas. Theft, mostly. She turned to see ARKHAM behind her, his armor glinting in the setting sun.
"Don't we look a bit conspicuous?"
DANIKA asked.
"Would you rather be back in your shorts?"
ARKHAM asked, already scanning the area for potential attackers. He had all of his weapons holstered.
No,
Danica said, picking up speed towards the roadblock ahead.
I just think it makes us stand out a little.
What's wrong with that?
Arkham asked, joining her in a jog towards the chaos. Danica didn't reply. She was focusing. She heard someone who she presumed was a cop shout something like "freeze," but then more shots were fired. She and Arkham ducked down as they drew closer, keeping low and quiet. Around them, stationary cars were in various states of carnage, some with just a wing mirror missing, others overturned, being engulfed by flames. They used the smoke to their advantage, both holding their breath as their vision took time to adjust. There was a car that seemed safe enough to hide behind. It had all of its windows smashed in. Danica put a hand on Arkham's shoulder.
Can you see anything?
She asked. Arkham peered through the broken driver's side window, and then out through the broken passenger side window. He could see that 2 police officers had taken cover behind a car. 10 meters over, there was a turning that led up towards North Caroline Street. The turning itself was blocked by a row of 3 customized cars, and in front of that row sat 2 more cars, one in front of the other, blocking the whole right-hand side of the North Central Avenue road. That was the block that they needed to clear. Arkham relayed all of this information to Danica, who replaced Arkham's position, and took a look for herself. There were figures atop 2 of the cars in the blockade. Danica had seen the light before. Gang members who thought they owned the place just because law and order had broken down. They thought that gave them an excuse, but they weren't doing it because they believed in anarchy. They just found anarchy easier. More convenient if you steal everything you own anyway. It made her sick, and it was what made her draw her gun and maneuver around the side of the car. She could sense Arkham behind her.
Rubber bullets,
he said. She stopped, turning around to glare at him, and she knew that she had a look in her eyes that she didn't want him to see, but she couldn't help it.
Are you serious? Their bullets aren't rubber.
She hissed this as she didn't want to be heard. The silence between gunshots was deafening. The screaming only served as some background inverted pedal.
I'm no different,
Arkham said, presenting a different gun from the one he had picked out back at the Wilmington compound.
I don't want to give those cops any reason to shoot at us too. Just need to intimidate those guys long enough to get close enough to take them at close range.
That's a load of crap, Danica said. They're not gonna drop their guns at close range, and this armor's good, but it's not that good.
You'd be surprised,
Arkham said.
You just don't want me to kill anyone.
I'd like to avoid it,
Arkham said, breaking eye contact.
I'll do my best. It's not like I haven't done it before, right?
He looked her in the eye again.
I'm well aware, but right now it's not necessary.
What do you mean you're well aware?
Arkham sighed, peeking through the window again.
I wouldn't have brought you with me or given you that armor if I didn't already know that you knew how to use it.
Knowing that they didn't have time to explore that sentence any further, Danica just nodded and broke cover slightly, moving slowly to the next car, rolling, crawling, now vaulting the bollards, edging closer, not needing to glance back, knowing that her new friend was behind her. They both stopped again, the constant gunfire a good mask for the racket they were now both making, stepping on the broken window glass. She glanced back at the 2 cops. One of them had caught her eye accidentally. Danica knew that the policewoman could see her about to attack one of the gang members around the side of the first row of cars on the corner. He was looking the other way, no doubt keeping watch for any possible attack from the other direction. The other 3 gang members stood on the hoods of their cars, occasionally jumping on and off, firing wildly in the direction of the 2 officers. They didn't see Arkham and Danica pass by, and still didn't turn around when Danica's blow from the butt of her gun connected with the shaven head of the watchman. He stumbled forward but wasn't incapacitated. He turned and glared at Danica, fuming and raising his own handgun.
Hi,
Danica said, before bringing her right leg up in a roundhouse kick motion, knocking the gun out of Shavenhead's hand. It hit the floor and erupted. The bullet that fired ricocheted off the bumper of the first car in the row of 3, skimming Shavenhead's leg. He yelped out in pain and toppled towards Danica, giving her the opportunity she had been waiting for. Clenching her fist and putting all of her power behind it, she brought her elbow back just as the yelping sound hit her ears, and launched her semi-armored fist into his jaw, disorientating him enormously as he hit the floor. Hard, rolling slightly. He wasn't getting up anytime soon. The gunshot that went off caught the attention of the first gunman, causing him to turn around, gun poised, to find Arkham speeding towards him. Arkham launched his fist into the gunman's face, grabbing the man's gun with the other hand, pointing it away from both of them. The man screeched as he took the punch, a powerful blow that dazed him, giving Arkham a chance to launch his head right in the same spot he had connected his first blow. The gunman stumbled, tripping over a traffic cone that was standing behind him. He fell, crumpling into a heap. In that same second, Danica pulled the trigger on the gun that Shavenhead had dropped, hitting the arm of the only other armed man in the group, who was aiming at Arkham. Arkham turned to see the Caucasian man with a denim jacket and a shotgun tumble off of the hood of the car, hitting one of the bollards on the way down. Arkham witnessed Danica vault over the hood of that same car, the first car in front of the row of three, and kick him square in the chest. He shunted over, rolling on the tarmac. Danica stepped on his smoking gun, poised to kick it, raising her own gun to point at the other gang member who was armed with a knife. Danica was now standing on the chest of the man with the injured arm, and had kicked away the shotgun, out of reach of both her and the older man with the knife.
"Don't,"
Arkham said. As Danica raised Shavenhead's gun, she pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire. It was empty. Who the fuck had a gun that only had 2 bullets? The man with the injured arm below her was now grabbing at Danica's leg, the adrenaline causing the shock to subside. She began to lose her footing as the older man with the knife came forward, a look of total venom in his eyes. His yellow teeth clenched. Danica stepped off the man on the ground who was attempting to trip her, falling back slightly, holding her hands out in front of her to brace for the attack centimeters away. The man with the knife lunged, and just as he did so, a fountain of blood tore from his neck. It had come from Danica's left, and as she righted herself, kicking the man on the ground in the face, this time knocking him out completely, she looked at Arkham. He had his palms open and his body shaped in an after-throw pose.
"God damn it,"
she heard him say.
"What?"
Danica said, glancing down to check that the man beneath her was out cold.
"I was aiming for his shoulder."
Danica smiled cheekily. "No, you weren't." Just as she said this, the man that had fallen over the traffic cone suddenly rose and lunged at Arkham. Danica took a deep breath, and time stopped as it always did for her when she was truly focused. In the space of a couple of seconds, she drew one of the knives Arkham had given her back at the compound from her belt, flipping it in her hands so that she was holding the blade, and launched it at the assailant that was bearing down on Arkham. As the gap between the two men closed, so too did the distance between the knife and the attacker's neck. She didn't miss. She barely ever missed. And with the momentum that the attacker had built up from his charge, he careered into one of the stone bollards in the middle of the road. Arkham stared at the gang member's body, now bleeding, dying. Then he turned back to Danica.
"Okay. No, I wasn't."
"We need to move these cars,"
Danica said, moving swiftly on. She turned back to look up North Central. They didn't need to move all the cars, just the 2 blocking the right-hand side.
"Can you hotwire the Challenger?"
Arkham asked.
"I'm gonna get on the radio to Martin. We'll push the other one,"
he said, pointing at the battered Mustang. Without saying anything, just smiling, Danica did what Arkham suggested, and minutes later, she could see their car making its way further up the avenue. The Challenger was now sitting on the left-hand side of the road beside the bollard, and Arkham was pushing the Mustang further up the road, mounting it on the sidewalk. Fuck, he was strong, Danica thought. When he made his way back, he put his hand on Danica's shoulder.
"You okay?"
Danica gave him a hollow smile.
"Why wouldn't I be? We've got a way through now, right?"
Arkham sighed, glancing at the men that they had incapacitated and terminated.
"I have no doubt that you can handle yourself, but it doesn't mean it's easy, you know?"
"Right,"
Danica said.
"Except the fact that it is."
Arkham frowned.
"What do you mean?"
"It gets easier the more you do it, but it gets harder to not do it when you know it is an option."
"I take it
Arkham was struggling with the constant use of the word for some reason.
is something you've had a lot of experience with."
"A lot of people trying to kill me. Mostly my fault. You and I have that in common, don't we?"
"Have you seen my car?"
Arkham said, smiling his one-sided smile. Danica laughed as the car pulled up. The driver's side window was wound down. "You 2 done indulging your self-destructive habits, then?" Martin said, taking in the scene, his face remaining utterly neutral. "I saw you 2 smile as you turned to run towards the fight."
"Did you?"
Arkham asked. "I did,"
"They're not self-destructive, Marty. They're progressional,"
Danica said, using the shorthand of his name for the first time, and gesturing with her arm down the now clear road.
"Now we can get to Wilkins Avenue."
They both entered the car. Arkham replacing his live guns in his holsters and grabbing a submission platform tablet to view the route that the car's GPS system had suggested.
The traffic's looking pretty clear. A lot of people have dispersed.
Oh yeah, Danica said, now realizing how much quieter everything was, and also realizing that the two cops were nowhere to be seen.
I went all tunnel vision again. At least it means we can get there faster.
I wouldn't count on it, Martin said, always the voice of optimism. There are probably hundreds more roadblocks like this on the way.
That's just negative thinking,
Danica said.
And even if there is, we can deal.
She was definitely feeling more confident now. Martin clearly picked up on this. There are things you're going to see very soon that you will not be able to explain. I guarantee you. Your beliefs and your confidence in your own existence may totally shatter. And you should be prepared for that. At first, Danica scoffed silently, rolling her eyes at Arkham. Given what she had experienced between the two men so far, she expected Arkham to roll his own eyes. But he didn't. Instead, he looked very serious, and Danica's scoff changed to a sheepish frown.
He's right,
Arkham said.
We know it's Galen. We know it's bad. But we don't know what it is.
Then he looked ahead, out of the windshield. It was starting to rain again, and as Danica looked out of her own window, at the back of the car, she saw the sky. There was a storm coming.
It seems we truly are sailing into the unknown,
Arkham said.
Chapter 27 White House Blues Part 2.
Doug Harrison sat with his fist underneath his chin, resting his elbow on the arm of the chair that was now stained with blood. He hadn't expected the blood spatter to cover as much ground as it did. The cameraman lay at his feet. The smell of death was already beginning to permeate the room. It was a smell that gave Harrison a strange sense of comfort. He remembered lying down beside his wife. She had been utterly still in her last moments. That was something that was unusual. When she was alive, she would often toss and turn in her sleep, more often than not injuring Harrison while she no doubt dreamt of their little girl. This also gave him an ironic feeling, as if she was subconsciously punishing him for their daughter's disappearance, and his lackluster attempts to find her. The irony didn't amuse him, though. It annoyed and disturbed him. 5 minutes ago, Harrison had used a custom-built laptop to connect to the security mainframe of the White House. One of the most hushed-up projects in his career was linking the White House security mainframe to the Spark Angel network. It was done before he took office, and it was completely off the books. And so, this may have taken a top hacker a matter of days, perhaps even weeks to accomplish. But the benefit of being one of the key members of the Spark Angel takeover was that he had access to all the relevant and valid security passkeys. It only took him a matter of minutes. Once the mainframe base code had been calibrated and processed, various icons began to appear on the laptop's desktop, one of which was the security camera feed. Below it was a list of all the rooms that had been sealed as a result of the automatic quarantine. He couldn't see anyone in the corridors, nor in any of the rooms which warranted coverage. He didn't plan to stay in the White House. He knew that the message he had just broadcast would have been seen by everyone, and he was slightly surprised that he wasn't being blinded by flashing lights outside his window, or being deafened by sirens. But Harrison consoled himself with the fact that he, the man inside his head, the man who had never not been there, would be the cause of that. The man would have warned off all the police he could afford, which, as Harrison was told, was practically all of them, in this city anyway. He would have warned them not to approach the broadcast location, for the time being at least. The nature of the message would have given them reason not to approach anyway. The paranoia that there might be some kind of secondary pathogenic detonation if anyone attempted to raid the White House would keep Harrison safe for now. The chaos outside would keep them busy, especially in a couple of hours, when the capital quarantine would fail. Harrison wasn't exactly sure how, but he had been told. It made sense. The catalyst couldn't spread unless the quarantine was broken, in whatever way it did spread. Harrison didn't know that either. But that didn't change the fact that he had to think about leaving, because there was no telling how long that paranoia would last, and it wasn't something Harrison was prepared to solely rely on. It suddenly struck him that the button under his desk was the cause of a shift in the balance of nature. He, Doug Harrison, was partially responsible for all that would happen as a result of this shift. He was the man who had his finger on the button. The first one, at least. He glanced over at the laptop screen, then at his customized smartphone that had been delivered to him hours earlier by Sam Fisher. His last act before he left to be with his family. Fisher didn't know what it was for. The same went for the laptop. He had just delivered them both without question. Like a good little soldier. The phone was connected to the computer via a simple USB cable. The parts that were used to construct the phone were basically miniaturized versions of those used to construct the laptop. The operating system that was used to run the security mainframe was being transferred over to the phone so that Harrison could control it on the move. The laptop bleeped and Harrison stood up, disconnected the phone from the laptop, and then made for the door, closing the lid en route. The people that worked for the man inside hadn't provided Harrison with a holster for the gun that lived in his desk. Harrison had therefore had to make do with stuffing it in his jacket pocket. It was weighing him down as he walked, reminding him of the fact that he may have to be on his guard. True, the security cameras didn't show up any movement in the building, but that didn't mean that Harrison was utterly alone in here. He squinted as he pressed the button on the side of the smartphone, lighting up the screen. He put in the 6-digit unlock code and brought up the mainframe. There were various sections down the left-hand side that had further lists of specific doors that could be locked and unlocked. After a 30-second search, as he stood awkwardly outside the exit to the rest of the building, he found the Oval Office main entrance door. A few taps later, he heard a metallic clicking sound coming from the lock on the door in front of him. There was a muffled bleep. Harrison reached for the handle and turned it. The door swung open, revealing the marble floors and the white walls. As he stepped out, he felt a chill rushing up and down his spine. Suddenly, the urgency of escape became more apparent in Harrison's mind. This urgency was almost pushed into overdrive as he heard a moaning sound coming from the other end of the corridor. It was a moan from a voice he recognized. The confusion was now rising.
"It's not possible,"
he said to himself, quietly. He knew he had to keep moving. It almost sounded like the moans were getting closer. He began to think ahead now. If his curiosity was to get the better of him, and he remained to identify the source of the sound, he would need to have an escape route planned if he needed to run. He took cover behind the wall that separated the corridors. One part of his mind was on the task of gauging the proximity of the sound. The other half was concentrated on cycling through the security feeds closest to his location in order to work out a route to the nearest exit. The proximity of the sound was increasing, and Harrison could feel the cold sweat running down his face, which he noticed in the reflection of the phone screen was also splattered with the blood of his second victim. The death of his first victim had been far quieter and a hell of a lot more calculated. The man inside was responsible for providing, through a third party, Harrison's wife's medication, and so he determined which other drugs could cause her to flatline if they were mixed in with her daily dosage. He provided Harrison with said drug. It was just a matter of paying off the chef to slip it into her morning medication cocktail. Once that was done, all she had to do was drink it. Harrison's only involvement in the end was encouraging her to finish her meds, which had never been an easy task, but he'd managed it. She had drifted into a sleep from which there would be no return. He had checked her pulse and confirmed that his task was accomplished. He had got dressed while she stared at him, eyes still open, fixing him with an accusatory glare. Harrison had managed to ignore it, even though he occasionally caught her eye in the mirror while he was shaving. It had almost resulted in him cutting his face with the razor. Harrison shook his head, temporarily banishing the recent memories. They would be back. The moaning had stopped. He rose up very slowly and peeked down the corridor. What he saw made him freeze. A light trickling of blood ran slowly into the corridor. The source of it was masked by the marble wall, and so Harrison was unable to see where it was coming from. He had to make a decision. Did he investigate or did he run? He groaned inwardly, because he was already beginning to tiptoe down the corridor. As he did so, the blood became thicker. He was halfway there now, although it seemed like it was miles away. Harrison was going into tunnel vision. Everything else seemed to go dark. His feeling of trepidation was almost replaced by an animal instinct. A sudden feeling of wanting. A feeling of thirst. Something was taking him over. Something alien. He dropped to his knees, but continued to crawl down the corridor. There was the moaning sound again, and the slight gurgling of something angry. Something different. Harrison looked up as the blood ran into where his knees fixed on the ground, now also covering his hands. The alien feeling was intensifying as his eyes focused on the figure above that had suddenly appeared from around the corner. The trickling, delicious blood. The beautiful pale skin, cracked and hardened. Strong, the bright, powerful eyes of augmented royalty.
Hail to the Queen.
ReD, Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective has 3 parts, listeners. 3 parts, and you've made it to the end of Part 1, Dissension. Stay tuned next time for Part 2, Infection. It is no longer safe to be human.